Welcome back for our second lecture on alcohol. We're going to be picking up with historical views on alcohol use in the United States. So before the American Revolution, alcohol was actually more commonly consumed than water, actually for relatively good reasons. Anytime that water goes through the processes of fermentation and distillation, it becomes purified along the way. So considering the lack of attention to safe water supplies at the time, it may actually have been safer for people to be drinking alcohol than water at the time. Now, drunkenness, though, this was viewed as a misuse of a product that was generally positive. So we didn't have a lot of cultural prejudice about the consumption of alcohol, even the consumption of alcohol by children. But we did see this idea that consuming excessive alcohol was a misuse. And then when it resulted in drunkenness, that was looked down upon. So although it was more common, there was a lot of pressure. There was social pressure to use it in a positive way. Now, after the American Revolution, this is when we actually started to see the beginnings of the movement that would culminate in Prohibition here in the United States. This is when we actually started to see alcohol itself viewed as the cause of serious problems. And it was the very first psychoactive substance to become to develop that cultural prejudice against. We followed that through with the use of heroin, but with alcohol, this was really the first one. So there was an early pamphlet written by a gentleman named Benjamin Rush. It was called An Inquiry into the Effects of Ardent Spirits on the Mind and Body. It was published in 1819. This is one of the first written artifacts we see coming out of the temperance movement. So in this pamphlet, he equates heavy drinking with health problems. And he proposes this idea. It was common in the movement at the time, but not a common perception yet in the United States, that alcohol use damages morality, and that he's one of the very first to present alcohol addiction as a disease. So out of this temperance movement, we saw these temperance societies. So they would be in a town or a city or other locality, and initially their goal was to promote not drinking harder liquor, from not drinking distilled spirits. And later, with success, that became total abstinence that they were promoting. So we had this idea of taking the pledge to not drink. And it became kind of a fashionable trend, not necessarily associated with changing one's consumption habits, but taking a public position regardless of one's private behavior. So this is really where we see the beginnings of the movement that we see culminating in Prohibition. So we tend to talk about Prohibition as that one specific time period with the federal ban on alcohol, but actually local jurisdictions started passing prohibition laws much earlier. Our earliest state prohibition laws began in 1851, and by 1917, in the time period when the 18th Amendment was actually passed, 2/3 of Americans already lived in what was considered dry territory where alcohol was not sold. So this really wasn't a revolutionary change for many Americans at the time. But then in 1919, we do see the passage of the 18th Amendment. So the sale, production, manufacture, and transportation of alcohol was banned, but we didn't see alcohol consumption stop. We still had speakeasies, those illegal clubs, and also private clubs where alcohol was available. And then remember, we still have those patent medicines available. And if alcohol was an ingredient of those patent medicines, it was still available for medicinal purposes. So if you've heard that phrase before, that's where it derived from. And of course, trying to enforce this was very challenging and very expensive. So if you've seen the Untouchables, those movies about the difficulties with finding people who are willing to enforce the rules, it's a pretty accurate representation of the challenges that law enforcement faced at the time. So when we look at the outcomes of Prohibition, of that 10+ year ban on alcohol sale and consumption, we see a couple of really challenging cultural byproducts of that. First was the transfer of large amounts of financial power into the hands of organized crime. So organized crime became more organized and more profitable. They had this money-making scheme of providing alcohol to those who chose to continue to drink it, and it really helped to promote the profitability of those ventures here in the U.S. And we continue to deal with the results of that throughout the 20th, and even into the 21st centuries. Now, we did see some great public health effects from that. We saw dependence on alcohol and alcohol-related deaths decline, as well as the incidence of liver diseases such as cirrhosis of the liver. So, some problematic results in terms of the criminal activity associated with alcohol, but we did see some very positive health effects during that time period. So the prohibition was repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. So really not a long time period when this amendment was in effect. And when we look at why it was repealed, not necessarily for very health-related reasons, but one major important contributor here is that alcohol taxes had been a major source of revenue for state and local and even federal jurisdictions. So we saw a decrease in the amount of money available for government spending. And also we had this concern that by outlawing this behavior and then not being able to enforce the ban on alcohol consumption, that we'd really discouraged a disrespect for the law and created a general sense of lawlessness in the United States. So once that repeal was passed, we did see a change in behavior. We saw alcohol per capita sales and consumption increase. And by the time we got to post-World War II, so 1946 and forward, we were back to pre-prohibition levels of alcohol consumption. So an interesting trend in U.S. history. It had its most lasting effect in terms of subsidizing organized crime here in the United States. So when we look at regulation and taxation after Prohibition, we did see that some states did remain dry after the amendment was repealed. Most did allow beer sales after the 21st Amendment was passed, and Mississippi was the last state in the U.S. to remain dry. And in 1966, they finally started allowing alcohol purchase and consumption legally. Now, in the 1970s, we saw drinking ages go down to about 18 or 19 in 30 states, but they were raised again to 21 following safety concerns. Now, this was actually something that the federal government had a hand in, based on the fact that powers not reserved to the federal government in the Constitution remain with the states. The federal government could not pass a federal legal drinking age, but what they did was they tied it to highway funding. So if states wanted to receive their federal highway money, then they had to return their drinking age to 21. So we did see that national standard for a drinking age of 21 pass here in the United States. In terms of taxation, when we look at the cost of purchasing alcohol, about half of that alcoholic beverages cost goes into federal and state taxes and licensing fees. Now, as we see with nicotine and tobacco purchases, when those taxes go up, consumption does go down. It doesn't have as dramatic an effect on alcohol as it does on nicotine, possibly because of the populations involved in purchasing. So, speaking of alcohol consumption patterns, this isn't something that's strictly an economic decision. They're definitely influenced by cultural factors as well. When we look at trends in the United States for alcohol consumption, we saw a similar pattern to some of the patterns we looked at for other drugs in our earlier lectures. We did see alcohol use peak in 1981 here in the United States and then begin to decrease. When we look at the current estimates of American consumption per person per year, the average American consumes about 27 gallons of beer, 3/4 of a gallon of spirits or distilled liquor, and about 1/3 of a gallon in terms of alcohol content for each of these. So when we look at how Americans consume most of their alcohol, most of it is definitely in terms of beer consumption, with spirits consumption being a close second, and then wine gaining, but currently in third place. So that 27 gallons of beer that the average American is drinking contains over a gallon of alcohol, but beer, it does have the most diluted, the lowest concentration of alcohol per volume, which is how those two numbers come together. So when we look at the patterns over the past couple of decades, in the yellow we see beer consumption, which has actually remained relatively steady. And then in the blue we see spirits or hard liquor, and we see a lot more variation in consumption there, with a real low in the mid-90s. And then wine, mostly increasing, a bit of a dip again in the mid-90s, but the red line there represents gallons of ethanol, so the average number of gallons of ethanol consumed amongst all beverages. So if you look at that big dip in the mid-90s, we see the clearest pattern there with the decrease in distilled beverage consumption. So if we decrease hard liquor, it has a much bigger effect than decreasing beer because of its higher concentration of alcohol. We also see regional differences in the consumption of alcohol in the United States, and we do know that a full third of the U.S. population does not drink at all. And we also know that about half of the alcohol in the United States is consumed by about 10% of the drinkers. So we have populations that don't drink at all, and then other populations that are much heavier drinkers. And we see that this is actually correlated with stress. That drinking rates are higher in states where people experience a great deal of social stress and tension. But we also see that accompanied by drinking norms. So our drinking rates are higher in states where the social norms approve of the use of alcohol to relieve stress. So if we see those things come together, then we definitely see a higher rate of drinking in that particular region. And if we look at a map how that breaks down, we can see the states in purple are the ones with the highest per capita alcohol consumption, and the ones in yellow are the lowest. So if you look at the states in yellow, then they might be kind of what you expect in terms of perhaps religious attitudes about alcohol consumption. But that's how it looks as a nation when we break down alcohol consumption per capita. Here in the United States, we also see gender differences in alcohol consumption. We've got males being more likely to drink than females, and males also likely to drink more per sitting, per drinking event than their female peers. Of course, always interesting to talk about drinking in our college population, and we do find that college students drink more than their non-student peers, and this may have to do with cultural circumstances and social norms on in the campus environment. Moving out of the end of the 20th century, we've seen many campuses that have banned the sale and advertising of alcohol. So back in the late 80s, even probably not the early 90s, but the mid to late 80s, you might still have seen alcohol for sale on campus in certain settings, and also alcohol advertising. But many campuses have moved to banning the sale on campus, and we've also seen some real changes in the tolerance for alcohol at parties. Despite these changes, we haven't seen an accompanying change in behavior. We haven't really seen a change in alcohol use in the campus environment, and we've actually seen a slight increase in both binge drinking and drinking and driving in the campus environment. So if you're not familiar with the definition of binge drinking, it is considered 5 or more drinks at one sitting for a male, or 4 or more drinks for a woman. So not something that everybody's familiar with, but that's the definition that we do use when we investigate binge drinking. So if we're counting drinks, we should probably talk about what that actually means. Undergraduates tend to be pretty familiar with these measures, but just to make sure we're all on the same page here, when we talk about a standard drink, we're basically talking about a half ounce of pure alcohol. And depending on how diluted the beverage is, this can be measured in different ways. All of the images in the picture represent the same amount of alcohol, just concentrated, different concentrations in different volumes. So about 12 ounces of beer, about 4 ounces of wine, and about 1 ounce of harder liquor. So if we look at the size and amount, it can be interesting to get out a measuring cup and measure out maybe 4 ounces of wine or 12 ounces of beer, and see if that's what you're used to being served if you do occasionally order an alcoholic beverage. So that will wrap up our second lecture. We'll be back to talk about the pharmacology of alcohol.